My car was dying, and I think it knew where I was taking it. The engine sputtered a death rattle with every mile, a symphony of complaint against the oppressive heat and the endless, indifferent asphalt. Out here, the Mojave Desert wasn't just empty, it was a void. The sky was a merciless, bleached-out blue, and the horizon was a ruler straight line that promised nothing but more of the same. I was driving toward the only job I could find, a last-ditch ad on a forgotten corner of the internet for a night attendant at a place called the Terminus Diner. The pay was obscenely good, the location was suspiciously bad. My bank account contained $47 and a whole lot of shame. I didn't have a choice. I saw it long before I reached it, a smear of defiant neon against the bruised purple of the approaching twilight. The Terminus Diner. It stood utterly alone, a single, low-slung building that looked less like a business and more like a wound on the landscape. As I pulled my groaning sedan into the cracked asphalt lot, a profound silence descended, the kind that presses in on your eardrums. Getting out of the car, a flicker of movement caught my eye. It was just my reflection in the large glass door, warped and thin. But as I drew closer, my stomach tightened. There, on the outside of the glass, was a single, perfect, child-sized handprint. It was stark white against the evening gloom, as if pressed there in dust or flour, and it was a good 7 feet up the door. My mind raced for an explanation, a prank, a tall person holding a kid on their shoulders, but no rationalization felt right. I pushed the thought away, blaming the heat and my own desperation for making me see things. I had to. $47 doesn't buy you the luxury of being spooked. The bell above the door didn't jingle. It let out a dull, toneless clank. The air that hit me wasn't the expected rush of stale grease and hot coffee. It smelled of ozone, like the charged air after a lightning strike, and underneath it the faint, metallic tang of old copper, like a spent battery or old blood. Behind the counter, a man was wiping down a spot that was already gleaming. He was tall and gaunt, with a face carved from old wood and a severe black suit that was entirely out of place. His hair was slicked back, a mix of iron gray and jet black. He didn't look up until I was right in front of him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I'm here about the night attendant job," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Liam Asher." He finally lifted his head, and I felt my breath catch. His eyes. They weren't just old. They were ancient, the kind of eyes you'd expect to find staring back from a dusty photograph, not a diner in the middle of nowhere. They held no warmth, only a deep, weary stillness. He looked me over, his gaze seeming to peel back my skin and take inventory of my soul. He didn't ask for my resume. "Liam Asher," he said, tasting the name. "I am Silas Blackwood. Tell me, Liam, are you a good listener, or do you think you're smarter than the person giving you instructions?" The question was so bizarre, so utterly unprofessional that I almost laughed. But the dead seriousness in his ancient eyes killed the impulse instantly. This was a test. My mind scrambled for the right answer, the one that would get me the job. The clever answer? The honest one? I looked at the threadbare cuffs of my shirt, thought of the eviction notice on my apartment door, and chose the only one I could afford. "I'm a good listener," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I do what I'm told." A flicker of something, not approval, maybe just acceptance, passed through his eyes. "Good," he said. He reached under the counter and produced a single, laminated card, its edges worn smooth with time. He slid it across the counter. "This isn't company policy, Liam. These are not suggestions. These are the 5 commandments of the Terminus Diner. You will learn them. You will live by them. You will not question them. You will not deviate from them. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, my eyes falling to the card. The rules were typed in a plain, stark font. The first commandment stated that if a customer in a blue cap arrives, my first words must be, "The first one's on the house." I was to serve them a Coke, specifically. No other brand. The next one was even stranger. If a customer ordered the special, I was to charge them exactly $6.66. The item was apparently in a box in the back, and the rule added a chilling instruction: do not look inside the box. The third rule targeted the very young and the very old. If a customer appeared to be over 90 or under 10, I was not to serve them. Instead, I had to call him immediately, no matter the time, and was forbidden from engaging them any further. My blood ran a little colder as I read the fourth. If I heard a noise from the walk-in freezer, I had to ask my coworker, "What's the temperature in the freezer?" If they gave any answer other than -2 degrees Celsius or 28 degrees Fahrenheit, I was to lock the freezer from the outside and run. And the last one, the fifth, was the simplest and perhaps the most unnerving. It said, never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the man who stands across the road. I read them again, a cold dread seeping into my bones. This was insane, a prank. It had to be. I looked up at Silas, a question forming on my lips. He must have seen it in my face. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly turned and tapped a long, dark finger against a brownish-red stain on the wall behind him, just near the coffee machine. It was a faint, ugly smear that I hadn't noticed before. The last guy who worked here, Mark, he was a thinker, Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He thought Rule 2 was a negotiation. Tried to give the customer a discount because he seemed like a nice fella. He paused, letting the silence hang in the ozone-tinged air. We're still cleaning his thoughts off the ceiling. My blood went cold. I looked from the stain to his dead serious eyes. The chill I felt had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't a joke. This was a warning, delivered with the casual finality of a death sentence. He turned back to me. The job pays $2,000 a week cash. Your first shift is tonight. You still want it? I should have run. I should have sprinted back to my dying car and driven until the terminus was just a bad memory. But I saw the eviction notice in my mind's eye. I felt the gnawing emptiness of my stomach. My desperation was a chain, and it was bolted to the floor of this strange, terrifying place. Yes, I heard myself say, the word tasting like ash. I'll take it. Silas Blackwood offered a thin, mirthless smile. Welcome to the terminus, Liam. Silas Blackwood left as silently as he had appeared, melting back into the desert night without another word. I was left standing in the unsettling quiet of the Terminus Diner, the laminated card feeling heavy in my hand, like a tombstone for a future I had just sold. The hum of the ancient refrigerators seemed to get louder, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The kitchen door swung open, and a man shuffled out, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He looked about 40, with tired, deep-set eyes and a permanent slump in his shoulders, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. You must be Liam, he said. His voice was raspy, worn thin. I'm Ben Carter. Yeah, I managed, tucking the rule card into my back pocket. Nice to meet you. We'll see, he grunted. But there was no malice in it, only in profound exhaustion. He showed me the basics, the temperamental grill that needed a soft touch, the coffee machine that gurgled like a drowning man, the specific way you had to stack the plates so they didn't slide off the warped shelves. It was all so mundane, so mind-numbingly normal that for a moment I almost convinced myself Silas was a lunatic and the rules were part of some elaborate hazing ritual. Just a heads up, Ben said, leaning against the counter and rubbing his weary eyes. The rules on that card, they're not a joke. Don't try to make sense of them. Don't try to outsmart them. Just do what the card says. No more, no less. You'll live longer. The simple, matter-of-fact way he said it chilled me more than Silas's theatrical threat. This was a man who had seen the consequences. The first hour passed in that thick, humming silence. Then the second. The desert outside was a wall of impenetrable black. No cars passed, no signs of life. It felt like we were the last two people on Earth, serving coffee to ghosts that hadn't arrived yet. My nerves were stretched thin, every creak of the building making me jump. Then, the bell above the door let out its flat, dead clank. A man stepped inside. He was of average height and build, wearing simple slacks, a clean white shirt, and a plain blue baseball cap pulled low. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule 1. He moved with an unnerving grace, his steps perfectly even, his posture unnaturally straight. He slid into a booth with a single, fluid motion, like a machine executing a command. He didn't look at me, not really. His gaze was fixed on the space I occupied, as if I were a transparent overlay on the world he was truly seeing. I took a breath, my throat dry. "The first one's on the house," I recited, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. The man didn't react for a moment, then his head tilted slightly. "A Coca-Cola would be most agreeable," he said. His voice was the most disturbing thing about him. It was a perfect, warm baritone, like a 1950s radio announcer, but it was completely hollow. There was no inflection, no emotion, no soul behind it. It was a flawless recording of a human voice. "And a hamburger, with fried potatoes, if you would be so kind." I nodded, my body on autopilot. I grabbed a glass, filled it with ice and Coke from the fountain, and placed it before him. My hand was trembling. "Coming right up," I squeaked. Ben caught my eye from the kitchen pass-through. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then went back to wiping down his station, his movements deliberate and slow. He was staying out of it. This was my test. I cooked the burger, my hands fumbling with the spatula. I could feel the man's non-gaze on my back the entire time. When the food was ready, I brought it over. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, palms down. "Thank you," the voice said, still perfectly modulated, still utterly empty. I retreated behind the counter, trying to look busy. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't eat like a person. There was no savored first bite, no casual reach for a fry. His movements were efficient, minimal. He'd lift the burger, a bite would disappear, and he'd set it down. It was less like eating, and more like the methodical disassembly of evidence. He finished in under 5 minutes, stood up with that same liquid grace, and walked to the door. "The meal was satisfactory," he announced to the room, then stepped outside and was gone. A wave of relief washed over me so powerful it made me dizzy. I'd survived. I took a deep breath, the air still thick with the faint scent of ozone and something else, something like burnt sugar. I grabbed a rag and went to clear his table, ready for the usual greasy mess. I stopped dead. The plate was there, the wax paper wrapper for the burger was there. The tall glass was there, but they were all perfectly, impossibly clean. There were no crumbs, no grease stains on the paper, no streaks of ketchup on the porcelain. The glass was bone dry, inside and out, with not a single drop of condensation or sticky residue. The food had not been eaten. It had simply ceased to exist. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I picked up the plate, turning it over in my hands. It was pristine, as if it had just come out of the dishwasher. I looked out the window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The man's car, a dark, nondescript sedan, was pulling away. It glided onto the highway with the same unnatural smoothness he possessed, and as it merged with the darkness, I noticed it. There was no license plate. Ben came up beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. He'd seen the look on my face. He followed my gaze out into the empty night. "You don't report them," he said, his voice a low, tired murmur. "You just let them pass through." The silence that followed the empty man's departure was worse than the silence before. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a listening, watchful thing. I found myself staring at the pristine, empty plate he'd left behind, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between what I knew was possible and what I had just seen. "You get used to it," Ben said from the kitchen, his voice doing little to reassure me. "Not the weirdness. You never get used to that. You just get used to not thinking about it." He tossed a dirty rag into a bucket with a wet slap. "Best you learn to do the same." I tried. For the next hour, I scrubbed already clean counters and refilled salt shakers that were already full, my hands performing the familiar motions of a diner job while my brain screamed that I was in a cage. waiting for the next monster to test the bars. The air still held that faint, cloying sweetness, like burnt sugar, a lingering perfume of the unnatural. Just when the quiet began to feel permanent, a low rumble started, a vibration that grew from a tremor in the floor to a bone-jarring roar that rattled the coffee cups on their hooks. A pair of headlights cut a brilliant swath through the darkness, and a massive semi-truck, its grille like a snarling maw, pulled into the lot, its air brakes hissing like a serpent. The diner door swung open with a bang, and the man who entered seemed to fill the entire frame. He was huge, with a thick neck and arms like tree limbs, clad in a greasy flannel shirt. He smelled of diesel, stale sweat, and something else, something sour and deep, like turned earth. He stomped over to the counter and slammed a meaty fist down, making the whole structure groan. He didn't look at the menu. He looked right at me, and my stomach plummeted. His eyes were not normal. In the dim light of the diner, they seemed to possess a faint, hungry glow, like the phosphorescence of deep-sea creatures. It was a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Give me the special," he growled, his voice like grinding rocks. The words from the laminated card flashed in my mind. Rule 2. If a customer orders the special? I glanced at Ben, who was standing frozen by the grill, his face pale and drawn. He gave me a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a clear warning, "Don't you dare mess this up." My own voice came out as a pathetic squeak. "That'll be $6.66. The trucker grinned, a terrifying sight that stretched the skin taut over his broad face. He didn't seem surprised by the price. He seemed satisfied. He reached into his pocket and threw a wad of crumpled, grimy bills onto the counter. "Get it." "The item is in a box in the back," I recited from memory, the last part of the rule echoing in my head. "Do not look inside the box." I turned and walked on legs that felt like jelly toward the back storeroom. The room was cool and smelled of dust and dry goods. Against the far wall was a single empty shelf, and sitting in the middle of it was a shoebox-sized container. It wasn't cardboard. It was made of some strange, fibrous material, dark and mottled, that looked and felt like very old, cured leather. As I reached for it, I noticed two things at once. First, it was radiating a distinct, unnerving warmth, like it held a small, living creature. Second, a low-frequency hum was coming from it, a vibration so deep I felt it in my chest cavity before I heard it. My fingers brushed against its surface. The texture was rough and organic, like a hide. As my hands closed around it, a single, clear thought bloomed in my mind, a thought that was not my own. Free. The word wasn't spoken, it didn't have a sound. It was an idea, a promise, an injection of pure, seductive longing that bypassed my ears and went straight for the soul. Free. Let me out. Free. A primal fear shot through me, and I almost dropped the container. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I clutched the warm, humming box to my chest and hurried back out into the diner, my mind reeling from the psychic intrusion. The trucker's glowing eyes were fixed on me, on the box. He snatched it from my hands with a greedy eagerness, his rough fingers lingering on mine for a split second too long. He tucked it under his arm, a triumphant smirk on his face. Without another word, he turned and stomped out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind him. A moment later, the roar of his engine tore through the silence, and then it faded into the vast, empty desert. I stood there, trembling, the ghost of that whispered thought still echoing in my head. I looked at my hands, half expecting them to be burned. Ben finally moved. He leaned heavily against the counter, his face ashen and beaded with sweat. He looked physically ill, as if he were about to vomit. "You okay?" I asked, my own voice shaky. He took a few deep, ragged breaths before answering. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the door the trucker had exited, as if he could still see him. "Listen to me, Liam," he said, his voice low and tight with a fear I had never heard before. "Some things that pass through here are just buying supplies." He wasn't. He was buying a key. He finally turned to look at me, his tired eyes filled with a terrifying sincerity. "Don't ever ask what it opens." Ben's warning about the key hung in the air long after the trucker's engine faded, leaving a residue of dread that coated everything. He retreated to the kitchen, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of cleaning, but I could see the tremor in his hands. I stayed at the counter, a sentry at the edge of the world, my eyes flicking between the rule card I'd laid out and the suffocating darkness outside the windows. The job had ceased to be about flipping burgers. It was about surviving the things that came for them. An hour crawled by, then another. My body was thrumming with a nervous energy that coffee couldn't touch. Just as a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle in my gut, the bell above the door gave its dead, hollow clank. They entered together. One was a man so ancient his skin looked like crumpled parchment, his back bent into a permanent question mark. He leaned heavily on a gnarled wooden cane, his movements painfully slow. The other was a boy of no more than 7 or 8, with wide, dark eyes. He stood unnaturally still, his expression a perfect, unnerving blank. They didn't speak. The old man's breath was a shallow, whistling sound in the quiet diner. The boy made no sound at all. My gaze jumped from the deep canyons on the man's face to the smooth, placid features of the child. Over 90, under 10. Rule 3. My blood turned to ice water. I shot a panicked look at Ben. He was standing by the kitchen threshold, his face a mask of dread. He saw the recognition in my eyes and gave a short, sharp jerk of his head toward the phone on the wall. "Call him. Now." My hand was slick with sweat as I picked up the receiver. I dialed the number Silas had scrawled on the back of the card. It rang only once. "They're here," I said, my voice cracking. The line went dead. There was no "I'm on my way," no acknowledgement at all, just a click, followed by the dial tone. I turned back to the room, my heart hammering. The old man and the boy hadn't moved. They were just waiting. I looked out the front window, expecting to see headlights approaching, but the road was a river of absolute black. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping a slow, agonizing arc. 10 seconds passed. 15. I blinked, and he was there. Not walking through the door, not getting out of a car. One moment, the space beside the counter was empty. The next, Silas Blackwood occupied it, as if he'd simply decided to exist in that spot. He was dressed in the same severe black suit, his ancient eyes fixed on the two visitors. He didn't greet me. He moved toward the pair with a slow, deliberate grace. The confrontation I expected, the shouting, the demanding they leave, never came. Instead, he stopped a few feet from them and gave a slight, formal inclination of his head. It was a gesture of respect, a strange, courtly bow. He spoke, but the words were not in English. They were a string of soft, guttural clicks and long, flowing syllables that seemed to absorb the sound in the room. The old man responded with a dry, rasping whisper in the same tongue. The boy remained utterly silent, his unblinking eyes fixed on Silas. After the brief, ritualistic exchange, Silas gestured, not toward the front door, but toward the solid, windowless side wall of the diner. He began to lead them, the old man shuffling, the silent boy gliding in his wake. I watched, confused. It was a dead end. Just a concrete block wall, painted a pale, peeling yellow. Silas stopped before the blank expanse. He raised a hand and laid it flat against the concrete. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the wall began to shimmer, the solid surface turning fluid, like a reflection on disturbed water. The concrete seemed to dissolve inwards, pulling apart without a sound to reveal a doorway. It wasn't a door to a back room or the outside, it was a portal to nowhere. The opening was a rectangle of pure, starless, absolute black. A void. A cold, dead wind, smelling of dust and ages, blew out from it, washing over the diner and chilling me to the bone. As Silas escorted the pair to the threshold, the diner itself seemed to recoil. The lights overhead flickered violently, buzzing and strobing. Every fork and knife on every table lifted a fraction of an inch and rattled against the cheap ceramic plates in perfect, jarring unison. The air grew thick with the smell of burnt sugar and the sharp crackle of static electricity, a smell that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The old man and the boys stepped through the doorway and were instantly consumed by the blackness. The impossible door held for a moment longer, a silent scream of nothingness. And then the shimmering reversed. The void collapsed, and the concrete wall knitted itself back together, leaving no seam, no crack, no sign that it had ever been anything but solid. The lights steadied. The cutlery fell silent. The silence that rushed back in was profound. I was leaning against the counter, breathless, staring at the wall. Silas walked calmly back over, his expression unreadable. He followed my gaze to a deep, dark stain on the floorboards not far from where I stood, a vague, man-shaped shadow soaked deep into the wood. "That's Mark," Silas said, his voice a low, instructional murmur. "The thinker. Before he broke Rule 2, he tried to break Rule 3. He saw a little girl who looked lost. He thought he was being nice. He offered her a free pie. He looked at me then, his ancient eyes pinning me in place. The rule isn't about being rude, Liam. It's about not engaging. It's about not offering them anything of yours, especially not your time." He pointed a long finger at the stain. Mark aged 60 years in 10 seconds. They feed on time itself. What's left of him is what you see right there. The ghost of the Century Gate lingered. After Silas vanished, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the diner felt violated, the very air contaminated by the memory of that starless void. Ben and I worked in a state of shared shock, communicating only in clipped, necessary phrases. He was scrubbing the grill with a frantic energy, and I was compulsively wiping down the counter, trying to erase the dark stain of Mark's fate from my mind's eye. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, and every sound from the ancient building was a potential harbinger of some new, unspeakable horror. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft, dull thud from the back of the diner. I thought it was just the ice machine dropping a new batch, but then it came again. Thump, thump, a pause. Thump, thump. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, a slow, heavy pulse. A heartbeat. And it was coming from the walk-in freezer. I looked at Ben. He had stopped scrubbing, his hand frozen mid-motion. He was listening, his head cocked, his weary face tight with a new kind of tension. "Compressors probably acting up again," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't believe it any more than I did. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of something patiently, methodically knocking from the inside. I should probably check it," Ben said, his voice barely a whisper. He set his cleaning brush down and wiped his sweaty palms on his apron. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a flicker of the same terror I felt, buried under years of weary resignation. This was his job. This was his duty. He walked toward the back, his steps heavy. I watched him go, a silent scream building in my throat. "Don't go in there." But the words wouldn't come out. He reached the heavy freezer door, pulled the thick latch, and stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft hiss and a heavy thud. And then, silence. The rhythmic banging stopped. But so did everything else. The low, familiar hum of the freezer's cooling unit, a constant background noise in the diner, was gone. The silence it left behind was absolute, a dead, suffocating vacuum. I stared at the door, counting the seconds, my heart pounding in my ears. 10 seconds. 30. A full minute. Just as I was about to call his name, I saw the shadow. It slid into view before the door even opened, creeping around the corner of the kitchen entryway. It was cast on the checkerboard linoleum floor by a light source that didn't exist. Ben's shadow was now impossibly long, a stretched and distorted caricature. Its limbs were bent at angles that were subtly, sickeningly wrong. But the worst part was its head. The shadow's head was canted at a brutal, inhuman angle, as if its neck were broken. My breath hitched, the freezer door swung open, and Ben walked out. Or, a thing that looked like Ben walked out. It wore his clothes, his apron, his weary face. But its posture was all wrong. He stood ramrod straight, his shoulders perfectly level, his movements too smooth, too precise. It lacked all of Ben's familiar, tired slump. It glided more than walked, taking perfectly even strides as it moved behind the counter. It looked at me, and its lips pulled back into a placid, empty smile. "All fixed," it said. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. My eyes darted to the rule card on the counter, Rule 4. If you hear a noise from the walk-in freezer, it was my only anchor in a sea of pure terror. I had to ask. I licked my dry lips, my throat feeling like it was full of sand. "Ben?" I managed, my voice a strained croak. What's the temperature in the freezer?" The thing wearing Ben's face stopped its work. It turned its head to face me, the motion unnervingly smooth. It cocked its head, mimicking the grotesque angle of the shadow I had just seen. The placid smile widened, and it spoke, not in Ben's tired, raspy voice, but in a chipper, perfectly synthesized tone, like a cheerful automated recording. "It's a pleasant 72 degrees Fahrenheit in here, perfect for storage." The words shattered what was left of my composure. The complete, cheerful break from all reality was more horrifying than any monster's growl. This was not Ben, this was a recording, an echo wearing my coworker's skin. My terror must have shown on my face. As I stared, frozen, the imposter's smile faltered. For a single, horrifying second, its face began to glitch, like a bad video feed. The features blurred, the skin seeming to pixelate and shift. Underneath the mask of Ben's face, I saw a momentary, nightmarish impression of something else, something with far too many eyes. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind the ice in my throat. My body acted without my permission. My legs coiled and launched me away from the counter, sending my stool crashing to the floor. I ran. My flight was pure animal instinct, a terrified surge that blew past thought. I slammed into the diner's main door, my clumsy fingers fumbling with the handle. Behind me, I heard a sound that wasn't Ben's familiar shuffle, but the quick, unnervingly precise thud of heavy, determined footsteps. The door flew open with a dead clank from the bell, and I burst out into the cold desert night, sucking in a lungful of clean, empty air. I didn't stop. I sprinted across the cracked asphalt to my car, the only sanctuary in this desolate hellscape. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, my hand already jamming the key into the ignition. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner in my chest. I risked a glance back at the diner's entrance. The thing wearing Ben's face stood in the doorway, its head still cocked at that sickening angle, its placid smile fixed in the pale glow from inside. It didn't follow me out. It just watched. My car engine turned over with a pathetic groan, then caught. I was about to slam it into reverse and peel out of there, to drive until the sun came up, but I hesitated. A morbid, paralyzing curiosity held me fast. The thing turned and glided back inside. And then the sounds began. It started with the crash of shattering plates, followed by the deep, resonant thud of a table being overturned. But it quickly escalated beyond a simple tantrum. I heard the high, piercing keen of the thick countertop buckling, a sound of something immensely strong being twisted apart. That was followed by a wet, tearing sound, a gruesome noise like thick canvas being ripped in two that made my stomach heave. And underneath it all, a new sound emerged, one that made the hair on my arms stand on end, chanting. A low, guttural chanting from inside the diner, in a language that felt ancient and wrong. It wasn't coming from the thing that looked like Ben. Just as the chaos inside reached a fever pitch, a figure materialized at the edge of my headlights. Silas Blackwood stood there, his dark suit unruffled, his expression grim. He hadn't driven up. He had simply appeared out of the darkness. He took in the scene, the chaotic sounds from his diner, my terrified face behind the windshield, with a flicker of weary annoyance. He gave me a single, sharp look that said, "Stay put," and then he walked calmly toward the front door and stepped inside, into the heart of the storm. The moment he entered, the nature of the sound changed. The tearing and crashing were joined by the shriek of something in agony, a sound that was not human and not animal, but something horribly in between. The chanting grew louder, Silas's voice rising in a powerful, rhythmic cadence. The strange, guttural words vibrated through the floor, through the frame of my car, and resonated deep inside my skull, making my teeth ache. This wasn't a fight. It was an exorcism. The terrible symphony rose to a crescendo, a final, awful shriek of breaking, and then a wet, final thump, and then silence. A silence more profound and terrifying than anything that had come before. A minute later, the diner door opened. Silas emerged. He was no longer pristine. His suit was spattered with something dark and viscous, a fluid that looked like a mixture of crude oil and ink. He was calmly wiping his hands on a clean white rag. As he stepped into the light of my high beams, I saw what he was cleaning. It was a long shard of something that looked like polished, black glass, curved like a fragment of a tooth or a claw. He carefully finished wiping it, folded it into the rag, and slipped it into his pocket. He walked over to my car, his ancient eyes fixing me with an unreadable expression. He didn't seem angry, just tired, infinitely tired. "It won't be coming back," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Ben," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Is Ben—" Silas cut me off, his gaze hardening slightly. "The thing you spoke to was an echo, a mimic. It gets inside a place, finds a host, and it learns." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The real Ben, Liam, he's been gone for 3 days. It got him during his shift Tuesday night." The air left my lungs. 3 days. I had worked with him. I had talked to him. Or I thought I had. The blood drained from my face as the full, horrifying implication hit me. Silas seemed to read my thoughts. He leaned a little closer to my window, his voice dropping even lower, sharing the cruelest detail of all. The real Ben called his wife every night at 2:15, on the dot. He was a good husband. He held my gaze, and his ancient eyes were filled with a cold, grim pity. The calls stopped 3 days ago, but his wife, she says she's still been getting them, right on time, every night. He straightened up, leaving me to drown in the horror of that revelation. We don't know what she's been talking to. The drive home was a blur. The familiar world of streetlights, sleeping houses, and late-night convenience stores seemed like a flimsy stage set, a fragile illusion I had just stepped behind. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The image of the glitched, shifting face of the echo was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The knowledge of what had been speaking to Ben's wife for the last 3 nights was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. I parked in my designated spot at the rundown apartment complex and stumbled up the stairs. The mundane reality of my life, the peeling paint on the door, the scent of stale curry in the hallway, felt utterly alien. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, my body moving on autopilot. And I froze. Silas Blackwood was sitting in the single, worn-out armchair I owned, as if he had been waiting there for hours. He hadn't forced the lock. I got the distinct impression that locks were a concept that simply didn't apply to him. He was just there, a pillar of darkness in my sad little living room. I wasn't scared anymore. I was too numb for fear. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, feeling the last of my strength drain away. "How?" I asked, the one-word question encompassing everything. "The diner isn't just a place, Liam," Silas began, his voice calm and steady. He didn't rise. "It's a lighthouse. And it's built on what we call a spire, a weak point in the fabric of things, a place where the walls between worlds are thin." He gestured to the empty air. "Most of the time the currents are calm. But sometimes things are drawn to the light. They drift through. Some are just lost. Some are hungry. Some are shopping. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the sheer cosmic insanity of his words. He saw the struggle on my face and decided to be more direct, connecting the horrors I'd witnessed to his impossible explanation. The rules are not arbitrary, he continued, his ancient eyes pinning me in place. They are diagnostic tools, field guides for the zookeeper. He ticked the points off on his long fingers. The man in the blue cap? We call that a husk, an empty vessel, a puppet of flesh animated by a will that is not its own. They are drawn here by a kind of resonance. Offering it a drink grounds it, satisfies its core directive, and it moves on. Simple. The trucker, Silas went on, his voice hardening slightly, was a trafficker. They are merchants of the forbidden. They trade in souls, in stolen years, in keys to places that should remain locked. The price, the box. It's all part of a transaction that keeps a very delicate, very ugly balance. My mind flashed to the warm humming box and the whispered word, free. The old man and the boy were temporal parasites, he said, and a flicker of something like disgust crossed his features. They feed on causality, on moments. They are drawn to those on the extreme ends of the lifespan. Engaging with them, offering them anything, invites them to feed on your timeline. What's left of Mark on the floor is a testament to that. Finally, he came to the creature in the freezer, and Ben's replacement was an echo, a mimic. It has no true form of its own. It absorbs a person, their memories, their voice, and creates a flawless copy. A recording. The temperature question is a logic trap. The echo can mimic memory, but it cannot truly reason or perceive reality outside of its programming. It fails the test every time. He leaned forward, the shadows in the room seeming to deepen around him. We are not flipping burgers, Liam. We are the lock on a door that must never be fully opened. We are the keepers of the lighthouse on the edge of the abyss. He stood up, his tall, gaunt frame dominating the small room. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on my cheap coffee table. You have a choice, he said. Inside that envelope is $20,000. A severance package. Enough for you to disappear. Get a new car, find a new city, start a new life, and spend the rest of it trying to convince yourself that the last 48 hours were a bad dream. No one will blame you. He paused, his gaze intense. Or, you can come back tomorrow night for your next shift. The pay is for the danger, Liam, but the work is for every person sleeping soundly tonight who will never know what stands on the edge of their world. He looked toward the door, a deep weariness in his voice. Ben was a keeper, and sometimes keepers don't get to clock out. With that, he walked to my door and let himself out, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my apartment. I stared at the envelope, a ticket back to the life I thought I wanted, and weighed it against the terrifying, world-saving truth. My $47 and eviction notice felt like a problem from another lifetime. This was a choice between ignorance and purpose, between running from the darkness or standing on the wall that held it back. I didn't sleep. The envelope of cash sat on my coffee table, a silent testament to a life I could no longer have. The money was an escape, but an escape to where? To a world I now knew was a lie, a thin, fragile veneer stretched over a reality of husks and echoes, and things that fed on time itself. To take that money would be to choose ignorance, to plug my ears and hum while standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. I thought of Ben, a good man who had unknowingly stood guard for years. I thought of his wife, answering the phone every night to talk to a pleasant, soulless recording of her dead husband. There was no choice, not really. When twilight began to bleed across the sky, I left the envelope on the table, got in my car, and drove back into the heart of the void. The Terminus Diner looked the same, a lonely outpost against the encroaching darkness, but as I approached it, I saw it differently. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a fortress. It was a lighthouse. It was the wall. The bell gave its familiar, dead clank as I stepped inside. The air still smelled of ozone and faint, burnt sugar, but now I recognized it as the scent of the front line. A woman was behind the counter, her back to me, wiping it down with an efficient, practiced motion. She was lean and wiry, with a dark ponytail pulled back so tightly it looked severe. "You came back," she said, without turning around. Her voice was low and flat, devoid of surprise. "Silas gave me a choice," I replied, my own voice steadier than I expected. She finally turned, and I saw a face that was all sharp angles and hard-won experience. Her eyes, a cool, steady gray, sized me up in an instant, cataloging my fear and my resolve. She wasn't grim, exactly. She was competent, the kind of competence that is forged in fire and leaves no room for pleasantries. "I'm Mara Thorne," she said, offering no handshake. "Grab an apron." "The coffee needs brewing." I did as I was told, moving into the space that Ben had once occupied. A fresh wave of grief and horror washed over me, but I pushed it down. This was the job. Mara worked with a silent, focused intensity. Her movements were precise, economical. She was a soldier preparing her garrison for the night's siege. As she reached for the coffee pot, the sleeve of her uniform shirt rode up, and I saw it. On the inside of her forearm was a scar I knew hadn't come from a slip of a knife or a burn from the grill. It was a long, thin, silver-white line, as straight and precise as if drawn with a ruler. It was an old scar, but it was stark against her skin, a permanent declaration. My eyes lingered on it for a fraction of a second too long. Her gaze snapped to mine, cold and sharp. "Rule 5. She said flatly, her voice leaving no room for argument. She pulled her sleeve down. "Don't ask." Rule 5. Never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the man who stands across the road. A cold dread trickled down my spine. The rule wasn't a preventative measure, it was a scar. We settled into the uneasy quiet of the beginning of a shift. The hum of the refrigerators was a low growl. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. But now, the silence was different for me. I was listening. I was watching. I was a keeper. The first hour passed without incident. The second began. The desolate emptiness of the desert night pressed in on the windows. Then, it happened. Jingle, jingle, jingle! The sound was sharp, violent, and utterly wrong. We both froze, our heads snapping toward the front of the diner. The bell above the door was shuddering on its spring, as if a giant hand had seized the door and shaken it with furious, impatient strength. But the door was closed, locked. It hadn't moved an inch. Mara and I locked eyes, a shared surge of adrenaline and disbelief passing between us. The parking lot outside was a black, empty void. There were no headlights, no figures, no wind strong enough to rattle a building. The bell fell silent for a 3 count. My heart hammered against my ribs. Jingle, 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 jingle. This time it was frantic, a demanding, angry summons. The bell shook so violently I thought it would fly off the doorframe. The sound echoed in the dead quiet of the diner, a command from something that was right outside, something that was unseen, and something that was absolutely furious. I looked at Mara, the veteran, the competent, unshakable soldier. Her face was pale, her gray eyes wide with a genuine, primal fear I had never seen before, not even in Ben. Her gaze was fixed on the trembling bell, her composure shattered. She turned to me, and when she spoke, her voice was a ragged whisper, tight with a terror that promised a horror far beyond any of the 5 commandments. "That's not on the list."